Good afternoon, everybody. I hope I'm audible. We're having an issue with our usual microphones, and so we're all speaking with lapel mics today, but I hope we're coming through loud and clear. I'd like to welcome everybody to this talk on Israel's security and the Arab Spring by Professor Benny Morris, who's making a visit to the United Kingdom, sponsored by the Anglo-Israeli Association, but he's actually also been here for the last 4 months or so, based at Oxford University, conducting research into a forthcoming book on Turkish-Armenian historical questions. Benny Morris is, of course, a noted historian on modern Israel, whose works have made a significant impact in and beyond academia. His writings have traced the Zionist-Arab conflict from the late 19th century. He's written about the 1948 war, is famous for his examinations of questions relating to Palestinian refugees, but he's also turned his eyes to the future, looking at such questions as the viability of a two-state solution and putting forward some proposals of his own about how the Israeli-Palestinian dispensation might evolve. He has a very interesting biography. He served as a paratrooper in the '67 war and later as a reservist in the Lebanon War. For 12 years he was also a correspondent of the Jerusalem Post. So he approaches these issues with a breadth of experience. Clearly, few countries have more reason to ponder the strategic consequences of the Arab Spring or the Arab Awakening than Israel. Important new dynamics are now in play in the region. None of them have really played themselves out, and the trajectories are still vague and uncertain in many respects. But a kind of a bifurcation is taking place, one could argue, in the Middle East, in which some states are making a transition to systems of government that are more accountable and open, while in other parts of the region there is a process of a kind of a conservative consolidation going on. Israel has to take as much note of developments in Syria and Egypt as it does of the growing tension, say, between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it has to navigate these various strategic shoals at a time when the American relationship, the relationship between Israel and America, is undergoing a degree of sustained tension. So we look forward to having some of these issues addressed and untangled for us today. Professor Morris has prepared some detailed remarks that will be very thorough. We do, however, want to make sure that there will be time allotted for questions and answers at the end, so this meeting might overrun its allotted time by a little bit. People who need to go at the advertised time of conclusion of this event, of course, welcome to do so, and it will not be taken as a sign of your voting with your feet. So with that, I'd like to turn things over to Professor Morris. Welcome to the Institute, and thanks very much for being here.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Back in the 1950s, Israel's founding Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion hoped that the regime change, revolutions in the neighboring Arab states would shoo in Arab-Israeli peace. The 1948 war had ended without peace. The old regimes, mostly monarchies that had launched that war, refused to make peace after their humiliation in the battlefields. So Ben-Gurion hoped that new regimes, untarnished by defeat and progressive, that cared more for their people's welfare than destroying the Jewish state, might usher in peace. And then came the revolution of 1952 in Egypt. A group of so-called free officers led by Gamal Abdel Nasser took power in Cairo. Indeed, already 3 years earlier, army officers mouthing progressivist phrases had already taken power in Damascus, and soon another group of officers would take power in Iraq as well. But no peace followed these regime changes. Old monarchies had been toppled and young so-called republican regimes had taken their place. But these new regimes proved as adamantly anti-Israeli as the regimes that had preceded them, or even more so. Indeed, the Nasser regime more or less forced Israel to go to war in 1956 and forced Israel again to launch hostilities in 1967. When the free officers took power in Egypt, Israel publicly hailed the new government and publicly and covertly sought to negotiate peace. But nothing came of these overtures except for some unsigned, vague messages from Nasser. He wasn't interested in peace, neither were the new regimes in Syria and Iraq. Regime change, even revolution, in fact had led to more rather than less bloodshed. This was in the 1950s. This may be the outcome of the Arab Spring as well. Indeed, the title may be a misnomer. Maybe it will turn out to be an Arab autumn, with the regimes being shed like leaves to be followed only by a bleak winter. One commentator has likened what happened in the streets of Tunis and Cairo to Russia's February revolution, and suggested that it might be overtaken and rechanneled by a second October revolution, in which a single-minded, vicious dictatorial party emerges as the ultimate victor when the dust of the current turmoil settles. The name Arab Spring derives from the 1848 springtime of nations in Europe, or alternatively from the liberalization of Czechoslovakia under Dubček in 1968, the Prague Spring. But 1848 was ephemeral and was followed by the restoration of absolutist monarchies. And the Prague Spring, some may remember, changed nothing, but lasted for less than 6 months and was superseded by a reversion to hardline communism and 2 further decades of repression and dictatorship. Is what is happening in the Arab world a real revolution, radically and permanently transforming the Arab world? And if it is, will that world necessarily change for the better? We are talking about a vast region with some 2,000 states, distinguished by great differences. Quite possibly the outcome will be different in different countries, and some might be permanently and positively reconfigured by the recent upheavals, while others might not be. And even if we are speaking about a real revolution, there is Zhou Enlai's famous response when asked about the long-term consequences of the French Revolution: it is too early to tell. Let's not forget that about a century passed before the French Revolution issued in France in a democratic republic. For now, one can only say that things hang in the balance. Regimes, to be sure, were overthrown in Tunisia and Egypt, but in Egypt, perhaps the key Arab country, the army remains in control. And elsewhere in the region, awful, vicious regimes remain in place in Damascus, Tripoli, Sana'a, and above all in Tehran. Thousands of innocents have been slaughtered in the streets. There has been a massive use of rape as punishment and deterrence, and many thousands languish in prisons for saying or thinking change. Moreover, popular protest was barely touched the crucial oil-rich Gulf states, especially Saudi Arabia, and Lebanon remains enthralled to the Hezbollah, the party of God. And even where regime change has happened, as in Egypt, what the outcome will be is unclear. If there are free and fair elections towards the end of the year, as scheduled, there is a probability of the fundamentalist Muslim Brotherhood either achieving control or at least attaining a major say in any future coalition government. One may deeply sympathize with the masses of educated youngsters who held out in Tahrir Square and with their aspiration for liberty and dignity, and yet note, A, that they may not have represented the majority of Egyptians, and B, that they may not come out on top. And one last word. Many outside observers noted during those winter months of upheaval in the Arab street that Israeli politicians and commentators, while sympathizing with the idealism of those on the barricades, were reserved or lukewarm in their judgments. One reason, little commented on in the West, was that throughout and clearly in the streets of Cairo and Alexandria, the calls were for ousting the dictator, not aligning with the West, which was castigated often as sitting on the fence. And many publicly identified the dictator, Hosni Mubarak, with Israel, or at least as having been soft on Israel. Mubarak was lambasted for joining Israel in oppressing the Palestinians, that is, in besieging Gaza, or being an agent of Zionism. Today he is being investigated for possible misconduct in relation to the Egypt-Israel natural gas agreement. There is a deep and sad irony here. True, Mubarak maintained the peace with Israel concluded by his predecessor Anwar Sadat back in 1979. But both Sadat and Mubarak made sure that the peace would be cold. No Egyptian tourism to Israel, no real journalistic coverage of Israel, no real trade or economic cooperation. Egyptians, like most inhabitants of the rest of the Arab world, were never really given a chance to know anything about Israel, save for its alleged oppression of the Palestinians. The Egyptian media and education system continued for decades to systematically portray Israel and Zionism as a malevolent alien presence, as essentially evil. The schools and media inculcated hatred of Israel, often with a blatant anti-Semitic spin. So the masses of youngsters who poured into the streets of Cairo, like those currently protesting in the streets of Syria, may have hated the regime that oppressed them, but they also hate and hated Israel. As regards the West more generally, there is at best ambivalence. Yes, young educated Arabs who led the street protests in Cairo and Tunis and Bahrain and Hama may appreciate American and European freedoms. Many have traveled in the West or even attended the so-called American or French universities in the region. But many, including these youngsters, are also bitter towards the West that allegedly has aggressed against the Arab world and continues, they believe, to dominate and exploit their countries and societies. And the more conservative and religious elements in these societies, which in some of them may be demographically dominant, continue to see the West as both aggressor and pollutant, a civilization that challenges and undermines their own values and cultures, in short, their world. Let me turn for a moment to pre-Arab Spring Israel. The Jewish state has been under siege since its inception in 1948 by the surrounding Arab and Muslim worlds. The Arab and Muslim worlds opposed Israel's establishment and denied its legitimacy and continued to oppose its existence and deny its legitimacy. A lull in this siege seemed to occur with the signing of the Israel-Egypt and Israel-Jordan peace treaties in 1979 and 1994, respectively, and with the partial agreements reached between Israel and the PLO during the 1990s. But these treaties and agreements were reached between governments and regimes. Sadat of Egypt and Hussein of Jordan and Arafat of the Palestinians may have signed documents, but their societies continued to oppose Israel's existence and to regard Zionism as fundamentally and completely illegitimate. And this delegitimization of Israel and indeed of the peace treaties was promoted precisely in those elite sectors of society among lawyers and doctors and journalists' associations where one might have expected a little tolerance, openness, and possibly understanding to exist. There were exceptions like the Egyptian Nobel Prize winner Naguib Mahfouz, but they were rare and far between, almost unique. One may also recur what actually happened to Mahfouz near his home. But the regimes of Sadat and then Mubarak in Egypt and Hussein and then Abdullah II in Jordan concluded and then cleaved to the peace treaties, not out of any sympathy for Zionism or any recognition of Zionism's full or partial legitimacy, but out of their appreciation of their country's own interests. Peace or non-belligerency with Israel was good for Egypt and good for Jordan. War had been and would be bad. The peace treaties and agreements, but especially the treaty with Egypt, which had had and perhaps still has the largest and strongest army in the Arab world, allowed Israeli leaders a measure of strategic freedom and safety. The treaty with Egypt enabled Israel to fight the PLO in Syria, in Lebanon in 1982, without worrying about its southern border. It allowed Israel to destroy the Iraqi nuclear plant a year before and the secret Syrian nuclear facility at Deir Zor in 2007, without a real fear that these might ignite a war on Israel's front, eastern front, simply because the Syrians and Iraqis and Jordanians understood that without Egypt, they wouldn't stand much of a chance militarily. The peace treaty with Egypt also allowed Israel a relatively free hand in crushing the Palestinian uprisings, especially the Second Intifada, which began in 2000. Egypt may have protested or even briefly recalled its ambassador, but its troops, crucially, remained in their barracks. Nonetheless, Israel during the past 3 decades has continued to live under siege. Syria and Iraq, until Saddam's overthrow in 2003, remained bellicose. So did many Palestinians, especially those adhering to the Hamas, peppering Israel with waves of terrorism and with the threat of terrorism. And in Lebanon arose an effective military organization called the Hezbollah, in part in response to the Israeli invasion of 1982. And behind these loomed the large shadow of fundamentalist Iran, which over the past decade has massively supplied the Hezbollah and Hamas with rockets, which present a serious threat to Israel's well-being, as was demonstrated in the north of Israel during 2006, during the Hezbollah-Israel conflict. Since then, both organizations have been massively resupplied with rockets and missiles. Some say that the Hezbollah now has 40,000 short and medium-range rockets, some of which cover the Tel Aviv area and points south. At present, Israel's northern border and its border with the Gaza Strip in the south remain largely quiescent. partly because of the blows suffered by the Hezbollah in 2006 and the Hamas in 2009. But either or both fronts could erupt again, possibly as a result of an Israeli-Iranian confrontation. To neutralize the rocketry threat from Lebanon and Gaza, Israel would then need to invade these territories and physically destroy one or both of these organizations. This would necessitate a ground invasion or ground invasions, which would be problematic on many levels, including political and moral. But it is the likely scenario if one or both unleash their rockets on Israel, on Israeli urban concentrations, especially Tel Aviv, and on Israel's Air Force bases. In 2006, Israel tried neutralizing the Hezbollah rocketmen from the air, but it didn't work, especially with the Air Force fettered by legal and moral inhibitions. In part, this also characterized the indecisiveness of Israel's campaign against the Hamas in Gaza in 2009. Sorry. But the Hezbollah and Hamas, who are to a degree proxies of Iran, are a minor problem when compared to Iran itself, which is steadily moving towards a nuclear weapons capability. If not stopped, Iran will have nuclear weapons within a few years, an Iran led by religious fanatics, some of them millenarians, in Iraq whose leaders are not reasonable people by Western lights, who deny that the Holocaust ever took place or that there are homosexuals in their country. An Iran that since the inception of the Ayatollah's regime has indulged in reckless, dangerous provocations, beginning with the takeover of the American embassy in Tehran and ending more recently in the capture of boatloads of British seamen in the Persian Gulf. These people are existential gamblers who say openly that Israel must and will be destroyed, and soon, and whose biggest gamble is, of course, their nuclear project, which most Israelis believe is primarily directed against them, against Israel itself. It may have originated in Khomeini's day as a means of deterring Saddam's Iraq or with an eye to eventually punishing Saddam, but since Iraq's demise, the Iranian nuclear project can have only one possible concrete target, the Jewish state. The American effort to halt the Iranian project by mobilizing international sanctions or by threats, and Israel's efforts, clandestine or by fielding threats of its own, have palpably failed. The only sanctions that may have worked would have been total sanctions, that no one purchase anything from Iran or sell anything to Iran. Complete international isolation, complete ostracism. But this did not happen and won't, given the cynical policies of China, Russia, India, and some European states. So sanctions and Israeli clandestine operations may have caused some delays, but Iran is steadily advancing towards nuclear weaponry. For the Iranians, incidentally, the Arab Spring may have posed a minor challenge by way of possible infection, but it has been a boon in most other ways, principally by diverting Western attention and energies away from the doings at Natanz and Qom, and by weakening pro-Western regimes in the region. The Arab Spring, coupled with the American withdrawal from Iraq, is likely to enhance Iran's regional position. For example, Egyptian spokesmen have already hinted that full diplomatic relations with Iran will soon be restored. What I have described here is Israel's situation before the so-called Arab Spring. The upheavals in the Arab world have made the situation much more complicated and volatile, and for Israel potentially far more dangerous. Most observers look mainly to Egypt in this regard. The current rulers of Egypt, the military regime, has already signaled that it will take a harder line towards the Jewish state. A few weeks ago, that regime violated the previous regime's agreement with Israel and halted the export of natural gas to Israel, an agreement that supplied some 50% of the fuel for Israel's electricity generating plants. A week ago, Egypt announced that it had opened its border with the Gaza Strip, contrary to agreements reached with the US and Europe. How open that border will become is anyone's guess, though it is unclear whether Egypt will continue to inhibit the importation of arms, including rockets, into the Gaza Strip. At the moment, we are in an interregnum. No definite radical change in Egyptian policy towards Israel is likely to occur. But there is a definite drift away from the spirit of non-belligerency embodied in the 1979 peace treaty. The fear in Israel, and I think in Washington, is that a radical, perhaps fundamentalist Islamist regime will take over in Cairo, the October regime that follows the February Revolution's deposition of the Tsar, after this autumn's prospective elections. Such a regime might well formally annul the peace treaty. This has always been the Muslim Brotherhood's demand and position, dovetailing with its fundamental opposition to Israel's very existence. But the Brotherhood is not the only potential problem. The main prospective secular candidates for Egypt's leadership, most prominently Mohammed al-Baradei, formerly head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and Amru Musa, former Secretary General of the Arab League, are no more tolerant of Israel, though they may be more attentive to pragmatic considerations and Western goodwill. In other words, the secularists and Islamists who may emerge in the governing coalition after the autumn elections may find that the one thing they agree about is releasing Egypt from the shackles of the 1979 peace treaty, which, for example, has left the Sinai Peninsula, sovereign Egyptian territory, substantially demilitarized. It should be noted that the Egyptian remilitarization of the Sinai Peninsula in May 1967 was one of the main catalysts of the 1967 Six-Day War. It is possible that the Egyptians, in the short term, may shy away from formal treaty renunciation, and it is even more unlikely that they will initiate hostilities with Israel anytime soon. The Egyptians still benefit from massive American foreign aid, but a gradual unraveling of the peace treaty is on the cards. A radicalized Egyptian regime is likely to be more attentive than was Mubarak to the groundswell in the Arab and Muslim street. An Israeli-Iranian clash or a confrontation between Israel and any neighboring state or group, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, Syria, could well propel the new Egyptian leadership into belligerency. A third intifada by the Palestinians, which might well be triggered by the prospective September vote on Palestinian statehood at the UN General Assembly, might pose a challenge to the new rulers in Cairo that they will be unable to ignore. Even amassing of Egyptian divisions along the Suez Canal without violating the peace treaty clauses could crucially limit Israel's strategic options, tying down IDF divisions in the south and reducing Israel's ability to square off against enemies in the east and north. And even short of military confrontation, a politically radicalized Egypt might have strategic regional implications. The West's position in the region will be further undermined. Pro-Western regimes across the region will think twice about maintaining their ties with Washington. A possible paradigm might be the Middle East in the 1950s and 1960s, when a radical regime in Cairo managed to undercut Western, primarily Britain's, position in the Middle East. Egypt has often served as the fulcrum of the Arab world. Without doubt, the Arab world, as often in history, will swing with Egypt, perhaps even into alignment with Iran, overcoming Sunni Shiite divisions. And a radicalized Egypt will no doubt affect the Palestinians too. It will bolster the power of the Hamas, the Palestinian offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood, and deflate the secular forces in the Palestinian arena, reducing any chance of an Israeli-Palestinian compromise. In sum, what I am saying is that the short and long-term consequences of the Arab Spring are unclear. We may be witnessing the start of a process that will extend for decades, perhaps centuries. The overall upshot may well be, on large, that authoritarian, dogmatic, radical Islam may replace authoritarian secular regimes. But that is in the future. What is clear so far is that a number of prudent Arab rulers, primarily Mubarak, have been overthrown or are under threat of deposition, rulers who were aligned with the West and who by Western liberal lights were no angels, but whose actions were cautious and reasonable and usually predictable. What replaces them may well be an extended period of instability and rulers governed by extremist ideologies and absolutist aims. When it comes to Israel, they may prove reckless and warlike. Given the gradual empowerment of Iran and the possible enlargement of its realm of influence, the Middle East may be heading for a new dark age.
Well, thank you very much for that. A very detailed and wide-ranging presentation. We do now have some time for questions and comments from the floor. If you'd like to make an intervention, please catch my eye, and when the microphone reaches you, please give your name and your affiliation for the speaker's benefit. First person to catch my eye was a gentleman here in the third row on the right-hand side.
Michael Knight, I'm a freelance journalist.
are the strategic opportunities for Israel to exploitate, to shape the events rather than to react to them?
It's not clear. Firstly, I'm not a policymaker. I'm an observer and basically an historian meddling in current affairs. It's problematic for any Israeli government. In terms of emotions and the heart, one goes out to the youngsters on the barricades fighting off tanks and bullets, and I'm sure Israeli leaders feel exactly that. At the same time, they know that these youngsters don't like Israel. In fact, they hate Israel, have been brought up to hate Israel, and supporting them may well empower people who are even more aggressive against Israel. So Israelis are caught on the horns of a dilemma, especially when people like Mubarak were under threat, a man who at least cleaved to the peace treaty, which maintained a stable southern border. So one liked the people in Tahrir Square. One didn't think they maybe represented most Egyptians. They didn't. Most Egyptians don't know English and didn't go to the American University in Cairo. But on the other hand, Mubarak was a force, a positive pro-Western force in the region and in terms of Israel. So it really is a problem what one should recommend and tell or ask Netanyahu to do. The problem is that he does things in a way which seems to alienate everybody, even though his position is quite logical.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of questions at a time and then allow you to respond to those rounds. Sajid Ali Khan in the second row here, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Morris. In your presentation, you failed to take up the question of a strong Turkey united with a strong Egypt and maybe a strong Persia. We've now seen Persian warships after 30 years coming up the Suez Canal, and also Chinese warships, probably for the first time since years. So could you just tackle that new strategic balance? Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then Dana Allen in the front row.
Thanks. Professor Morris, this is a comment rather than a question.
Can we just have a microphone for Dana, please?
Sorry. This is a comment more than a question, but the question is, would you respond, I guess. You know, there's this cliche, which I guess is true, but you're the historian, you can tell me whether Abba even really said that the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And some of us, and when I say some of us, it includes I think a lot of people in Washington and the United States are really starting to worry that Israel is never missing an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And your extremely dark and worst case presentation of Israel under siege sort of, colors that. Everything you said is plausible, but it's worst case piled upon worst case, in which case, the proper response to every worst case being piled on every worst case would be paralysis. I mean, just to take one example, there's no other reason for Iran to develop, Iran developing nuclear weapons capability is disastrous and reckless and terrible, but the idea that there's no other reason for it other than to destroy Israel, you alluded to the fact that they were the victim of chemical weapons attacks that were strategically significant, condoned by the United States at the time, and I could just add that they've been the subject of a lot of American regime change kind of rhetoric. So I guess what one hears from a narrative from Israel is this idea that Israel cannot be safe until its legitimacy, there's a, Arab hearts are transformed, Iranian hearts are transformed. This doesn't seem to me the way the world works. The way the world works is that Israel has established not its right to exist, but the reality of its existence. It can defend itself. The United States is committed to help defend it. And what has to follow from that is a pragmatic acceptance of realities by the rest of the world, including the Arab world. That's how other conflicts end. On questions, this this is without mentioning the whole Palestinian issue. Excuse me for going on at that length, but my only question is to ask for a response.
Okay, just one thing I'm afraid I have to catch you off on is I didn't say that Israel is the reason the Iranians have developed the bomb or the only reason they want to pursue nuclear capability and bombs. As I said, it began with the Iraqis. It's the only possible target of Iranian, that's what I said, the only possible target of use of Iranian nuclear bombs. They're not going to bomb Saudis.
Weapons. I'll shut up.
No, there are other reasons. They want to become strong regionally and powerful and influential and to counter possible American attacks on them, and nuclear bombs will fend all these off. But the only possible use of the bombs is Tel Aviv. Let me continue. You're saying that Israel doesn't have to require or demand legitimacy. It exists, it's powerful, it has an American umbrella of sorts. And maybe that should be sufficient. What I'm saying is that at base, the delegitimization of Israel, the perception of Israel as illegitimate, will continue to fuel antagonism towards Israel and hostilities towards Israel essentially forever. Even if Israel is very powerful, Palestinians still plant bombs when they can in Tel Aviv. It doesn't matter whether Israel is powerful or not, and Iran is developing nuclear bombs despite the fact that Israel probably has nuclear bombs and could bomb Iran into the Stone Age. But this doesn't seem to be deterring them. So what I'm saying is the legitimacy, the acceptance, the change of mindset, which I believe is necessary in the Middle East for an end to the conflict, that hasn't occurred yet, and that must occur if there will be an end to the conflict, because otherwise the conflict will be perpetuated by those who are unfortunately a vast majority in the Arab world who consider Israel an illegitimate presence without any reason for being there, a robber state, and so on. Missing opportunities to miss an opportunity is quite, as far as I know, you're quite right, was coined by Abba Eban, the legendary Israeli foreign minister. The Arabs did miss lots of opportunities for peacemaking if they ever wanted them, and chances to get a Palestinian state. In 1937, the Peel Commission proposed to the Palestinians and the Arabs a state in Palestine, over 80% of Palestine, a joint Palestinian-Jordanian entity. They rejected it. The Jews were given by the Peel Commission 17% of the territory of Palestine. The Palestinians said no. The United Nations in 1947 offered the Palestinians a state on 45% of the territory of Palestine, with Israel getting about 50%. The Palestinians again said no. In 1978, Begin and Sadat in the Camp David Accords, which have long been forgotten, offered the Palestinians under Arafat autonomy in the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, which everybody understood would devolve into a fully fledged West Bank Gaza state. The Palestinians said no, 1978. In 2000, Barak and Clinton offered the Palestinians a state including 95% of the West Bank, East Jerusalem essentially, and the Gaza Strip. They said no again. And in 2008, Israel's Prime Minister Olmert offered the Palestinians a state more or less along the Clinton parameters, and they said no again under Abbas. So we have a problem of missed opportunities, but you're quite right. Israel has also missed opportunities, even though I believe they are more in the realm of shadow boxing than real. What do I mean? I mean that whatever you will offer the Palestinians in terms of a two-state solution, Palestinians under Hamas and under Fatah, they will say no, as they have always said no, because they don't want a two-state solution. The Palestinians as a national movement, their ethos is all of Palestine. The entirety of Palestine belongs to the Palestinians, and they will not concede 1 inch, 2 inches, 20%, 50% of Palestine to the Jews. They can't sign that piece of paper, and that's why they never have. So missed opportunities Israel has made in the realm of shadow boxing, which I believe Israel should have indulged in. Netanyahu should have taken up the Arab League Saudi proposal of 2002 to negotiate a peace treaty with the Arab states and with the Palestinians. You can negotiate about how to resolve the issue of the refugees, and they made terrible mistakes and didn't. Netanyahu has made awful mistakes along the way since then in not halting the settlements, which I have always believed is an impediment to peace. Second, only to the major impediment, which is Palestinian rejectionism, rejection of any type of two-state solution. Netanyahu continues to make mistakes in this realm of missing opportunities in the realm of shadow boxing. In the realm of shadow boxing. They're not in the realm of reality, because no Palestinian leader is going to sign a piece of paper saying two-state solution, Israel 80% of Palestine, we get 20 or 22%, and we give up the right of return. No Palestinian leader, Fatah or Hamas, is going to sign such a waiver of the right of return. Right of return being 5 or 6 million Palestinian refugees being admitted into the territory of Israel, making Israel immediately an Arab majority state. In other words, no longer a Jewish state. In other words, no two-state solution. No Palestinian leader of either branch is going to sign such a piece of paper.
There was also a question about Turkey and
Sorry,
how Turkey
yes.
is beginning to intervene in Middle Eastern questions that maybe some Arab countries have traditionally considered to be their special preserve, and the relationship with Israel has also been quite turbulent recently.
Turkey is a very interesting country. Its evolution is very interesting. Its denials of its history are very interesting. There's lots of interesting things about Turkey. It's certainly evolving as a major player in the Middle East, and in some way a patron of Arab nationalist and even revolutionary movements. Israel, let me put this in historical perspective, if I may. In the 1950s, after something I mentioned recently, that the failure of Israeli-Arab contacts to make peace in the wake of the 48 war, Ben-Gurion said, well, we can't make peace with our immediate Arab neighbors. Let's at least try and forge alliances with the peripheral countries, the countries around the countries which surround Israel, which are not necessarily Arab and not necessarily Muslim. Abyssinia, Ethiopia, southern Sudan, Christian, Maronites in Lebanon, Turkey and Iran. And Israel did have firm dealings and firm contacts and connections, even alliances, with various non-Arab or non-Muslim peripheral states or bodies. And ultimately, what emerged from this was a good Iranian-Israeli connection, or Israeli-Iranian connection, until the Shah was deposed by the Khomeinists. And eventually, good relations were established, or real diplomatic relations were established between Israel and Turkey. I can't remember the date, but it occurred subsequently, I think in the 1990s, against the backdrop of the Israeli-PLO negotiations and initial agreements. And Turkey became in some way even a strategic ally, or at least the military in Turkey regarded Israel as a strategic ally. They allowed Israeli Air Force jets to train over Turkey. Israel refurbished and armed the Turkish armored divisions and aircraft. There was a really good working military and intelligence relationship between the two countries, and developing economic ties as well. Turkey was eventually overtaken in terms of internal politics by an Islamist, or a mild, moderate Islamist regime, which controls the country at present and is going to control it in the foreseeable future, given the recent elections. And this Islamist regime, I think, at base, doesn't really regard Israel as a legitimate presence in the Middle East, doesn't like Israel, but with an eye to Washington, has so far abstained from cutting its ties with the Jewish state. So far, it's maintained diplomatic ties, frosty diplomatic ties, critical diplomatic ties, but has maintained them for various, as I say, international reasons, not because of a liking for Israel or the Jewish state's existence. How it will play out in the future, we don't know, and much of this depends on what happens in these upheavals within the Arab world, and how Iran behaves and so on. I don't see that Turkey and Iran are moving into an alliance, even though they are both Islamist countries, or led by Islamist regimes. But I don't see them moving at the moment into actual alliance. And as I say, the Turks have so far refrained from cutting diplomatic ties with Israel, which is an important point.
Thank you. Nomi Bar Yaakov at the end of the room.
Thank you very much. Nomi Bar Yaakov, IISS member. I'm afraid some of your comments have now answered the question I was going to ask.
So ask another one.
Well, I'll rephrase it, but I was going to sort of as the title of your talk is Israel's Security in the Arab Spring, wouldn't sort of, and you described the threats as you view them, of, you know, the Arab Spring, or the Arab, yes, the Arab Spring is, it is termed. Wouldn't really an Israeli strong move towards direct talks with the Palestinians on final status issues be the response to all this uncertainty? Wouldn't this be high time, since Prime Minister Netanyahu and President Abbas have not met since Netanyahu took office, to actually address some of these issues, which you seem to have concluded would not succeed? I personally am not convinced that they would not succeed. I personally do think that there are formulas to the refugee question, and you and I have worked on them together, or with IPRI and other organizations some years ago. I do think there's a solution to the borders issue based on the 67 borders and what is known in the business as a one-on-one exchange. There are a number of formulas. Some settlements may be annexed. Other territory that is currently sovereign Israeli territory could be transferred to the Palestinians. One good thing, in my opinion, that the new Egyptian administration has done is concluded a reconciliation agreement between Fatah and Hamas. In Israel, this was very much viewed as a threat. Again, I personally view it actually as an opportunity, especially since Hamas are giving Abu Mazen a full carte blanche to negotiate. Whichever peace deal he will negotiate will be then passed on to a referendum. I personally, again, view that as progress and as an opportunity. I don't think that everything that is happening in Egypt is negative. I think we need to really look at the full half of the cup, because there is so much uncertainty, and move towards a sort of swift, aggressive, sort of serious move towards peace ahead of September, because September, as you said, could very well trigger not only a third Palestinian Intifada, but a whole regional serious sort of upset. Thank you very much.
Why don't you respond to that?
Okay, we're at one in wanting serious Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. I would be very happy if they were opened tomorrow morning between Netanyahu and Abbas, and the Hamas, if you like. The problem is, A, it's not going to happen. The Palestinians have resolved to go for this unilateral declaration of independence with international sponsorship or endorsement at the General Assembly. This is where they're headed. This is what they've decided to do. They're not interested in talking. This is in terms of the tactics of what's going to happen in the coming months. But as I said, I don't think, in addition to that, that if such negotiations were opened between Israel under Netanyahu and the Palestinians, they would result in a peace treaty. They won't result in a peace treaty. But secondarily, you have Netanyahu locked in and perhaps that way motivated himself by a right-wing coalition, which will not enable him, for example, to divide Jerusalem, to give the Palestinians East Jerusalem, as Barak had been willing to in December when he endorsed, December 2000, when he endorsed the Clinton parameters. He's not going to give up East Jerusalem, and there can be no viable Palestinian state and no pan-Arab approval of any deal which doesn't allow the Palestinians, doesn't give the Palestinians East Jerusalem. And Netanyahu is incapable of that. But that is the secondary issue. The first issue on the negotiating table is the right of return, or the refugee issue. And the Palestinians, no Palestinian leader, and it's not a matter of formulas. Formulas have been worked out from here till doomsday by Balin and lots of other people, and Clinton. But the Palestinians want the whole ethos of the Palestinian national movement since the 1950s has been the return, if you like, by comparison, to Zionism. The whole ethos of the Jewish national movement, Zionism, was a return of the Jews to their land, to the land which they believe belongs to the Jews, or is the Jewish, the crucible of Judaism and Jewish statehood. And the Palestinian ethos is a return of the refugees, to allow them back to their homes and lands which were abandoned or from which they were expelled in the 48 war. And no Palestinian leader is going to waive that right of return, and it's not a matter of formulas or how you work it out. They want Israel to admit that there is a right of return. 5 million plus 6 million, according to the Fatah, refugees should be allowed to home to their lands and places in pre-1967 Israel. Israel at the moment has 5.7 million Jews. That's the total Jewish population of Israel, 5.7 million Jews. It contains 1.4 million Arab inhabitants of Israel, Arab citizens of Israel. If you add to that 5 or 6 million returning Palestinian refugees, you have an instant or a gradual, if they return gradually, majority of Palestinian Arabs in the Jewish state. If it's a democratic state, it will necessarily be an Arab state, not a Jewish state, hence a 24th Arab state. The world has been honored with 23 Arab states, benefits from the existence of 23 Arab states. The Jews wanted one state for themselves. I think the Jews should have one state, and the Arabs can have 23 states.
I will take two interventions from the middle of the room. First, the gentleman in the third row in the middle. Then once you've asked your question, can you pass it back behind you, to the gentleman immediately behind you?
Hi, Will Crawford from G3. I just wanted your thoughts on the recent events in Syria. Is the Israeli position that, along similar lines to Mubarak, is Assad is better the devil you know rather than another who could potentially be less reasonable than Assad?
So
we'll just take one more question then. Yes, yes.
My name is Abdullah Hamoud. I'm an Egyptian-British journalist, and I happen to be in Cairo from 25th of January to 28th February without knowing or foresight of what was to go on. I would like to tell you that the Western educated people, young people, and their compatriots of the same generation, they took the same stand and they excelled the use of Western techniques and Western approaches to win, and they succeeded. The whole of the Egyptian people went around them, and the issue was democracy and reform. The relationship with Israel comes within the democracy and reform because we felt that Mubarak as a strategic asset for Israel was imposed on the Egyptian people and sold Israel the gas at reduced price in order to earn commissions, he and his cronies, which is being investigated right now. And we all know that. And the stopping of the gas now, it does not mean cutting off the supplies. The question is, do we need democracy in the Arab world, or do we need dictators? Do we need principles, or do we need self-interest? This is one point I'd like to say. The other point is, you spoke about the question of legitimacy of Israel. Legitimacy does not come from force. It comes from the notions presented and the acceptance in winning the hearts and minds of people. Are you really doing that in dealing with the Palestinians the way we see, in Judaization of Jerusalem, in stopping the right of return? You spoke about 5-6 million people returning. No, no one says that 5-6 million people will return. They say themselves that some of them will return and the rest prefer living where they are. They say that historians are the best people to read the future, but your answer to the question about the vision for the future and what Israel could do was not that satisfactory. Is this intentional? Thank you.
Being unsatisfactory is never my intention. And I never said that historians can read the future better than anybody else. I don't think that's true. What the Palestinians demand, I'll just speak from the bottom. What the Palestinians demand is Israeli acknowledgement both of wrongs in 1948 and the right of return, to acknowledge the right of return of refugees, of the refugees, to their homes and lands. Then they add to that the caveat, as Arafat once did in an article in the New York Times, well, we'll see how that will work out once they accept the right. The problem is that once Israel, in writing, in treaty, and formally, officially accepts the right of return, acknowledges the right of return of the Palestinians, you tell me, not all 5 million will return. I tell you, we don't know how many will want to return. So what if it's 4 million? Will that leave a stable Jewish state? 4 million people returning to homes which no longer exist, to houses which were destroyed, to fields which are being tilled by kibbutzim and moshavim. You believe that there should be a right of return and that they should be allowed to return. I tell you that it's not an individual issue of the right of each person morally to be able to go back to his home. It's a political and military, if you like, problem. And if they're allowed to go back, there is no Israel, because once you accept the right of return, you accept the right of implementation of that right. Otherwise, you're not accepting anything. You accept implementation, I believe there will be a mobilization of the refugees in the camps from Lebanon and Syria and Transjordan and maybe the West Bank and Gaza Strip to return to their homes. There will be terrible anarchy once implementation begins, and there will be no Israel at the end of the day. That's what will happen. Now, you say Israel has to prove its legitimacy. It hasn't behaved nicely to the Palestinians. It somehow has to persuade the Arab world that it's really a nice place and therefore deserves recognition as a legitimate presence. I tell you, it's got nothing really to do with how it behaves, to do with what Israel is. It's a non-Arab, non-Muslim country in an area which the Arabs regard as their sacred Islamic soil, and any other presence there is illegitimate. And this may include the Copts of Egypt as well, who are gradually being ground down. And this certainly included all the Christian populations in Iraq and Morocco and all the rest of the Middle East, which used to be, of course, mostly Christian. They no longer exist in the Middle East because their presence was, in the end of the day, felt to be illegitimate on sacred Islamic territory. Christians were thrown out. The Jews will be thrown out as well if the Arabs have the chance and possibility of doing this. Israel, to gain legitimacy, Israel is a democracy, a very flourishing economy, very creative place, much more creative probably than the whole of the Arab world together by various indexes according to the United Nations. But this that apparently is not enough to convince anybody of legitimacy. The Arab press in your country and in most places has never actually looked at Israel. It looks at what governments and spokesmen of various organizations say about Israel, which of course cast it as an illegitimate, evil presence. But nobody's ever actually in the Arab world looked at Israel and told the people, this is what Israel is, a combination of good things and bad things, creative in certain ways, oppressive in other ways, the same as most governments in the West are. That picture has never been portrayed, and therefore there's no real way of convincing anybody of what is good about Israel or slightly less than good and so on. There's a uniform picture of Israel also by those masses you talked about in Cairo Street. I completely endorse their will for democracy and freedom, but the fact that several thousand or million people gathered there and chanted this in a country of 80 million doesn't, to me at the moment, it doesn't tell me that this is the will of the Egyptian people. You say it's the will of the Egyptian people. I tell you, or I tell anybody, wait until the elections in September, December, and we'll see exactly what they will vote. If they vote for, in large numbers, for the Muslim Brotherhood, which says it doesn't want democracy, which says it doesn't want Israel to exist, we'll know where they stand. If they all vote for liberal democratic parties and push aside the military dictators at the moment and keep at bay the Islamists, perhaps you're right, but I think we should wait for September, December to know what's coming. Incidentally, as to something else which somebody here said, I didn't deliberately paint a very bleak picture, but I did deliberately give you the negative side of what can be seen as happening. Because I think the Western press and media are inundated by these liberal spokesmen you hear speaking in good English in Cairo and in Tunis and wherever else, and are giving you perhaps a slightly incorrect picture of what it all means. If you like to counter this excessive enthusiasm and optimism about what is happening, one has to hear a sort of a corrective. I think it's worth hearing it as well. Probably the truth lies somewhere in the middle, but maybe not. Maybe it lies closer to what I was presenting.
There's also a question about Syria. What does Israel want to see in Syria?
Again, these are awful questions in the sense that Israel doesn't like Assad. It didn't like Assad the father. Both of them were offered what they said is enough for a peace treaty with their country, the Golan Heights, and they said no. At the end of the day, they were offered 99.999% of the Golan Heights. There was some bickering about some several hundred square meters, not kilometers, along the northeastern edge of the Sea of Galilee, between Hafez Assad and Barak and so on. And they said no. On the other hand, what might replace this young, vicious Assad who still controls Syria might be just as vicious. They have no tradition. There is no tradition there of democracy, of liberalism, of tolerance. They've been brought up to hate Israel by these regimes. Anybody who takes over after Assad, I don't expect them to be any nicer to Israel. And as you say, they may really offer a picture of recklessness rather than at least the prudence which characterized the two Assads. So I don't know. It's like the devil in the deep blue sea. I don't know what is better. I really don't know. And Israelis probably don't know, from Prime Minister down.
Thanks. We'll take 3 last questions. Gentleman here in the front row first.
I'm Michael Zantowski. I'm the Czech ambassador to the United Kingdom and former ambassador to Israel. It's all largely been said, but still, I was wondering, even taking your explanation now that you deliberately presented the pessimistic side, whether what you've said corresponds to what we have witnessed empirically during the protests in Cairo and in Tunisia, and to a lesser part in Libya. To my view, there has been a conspicuous absence of anti-Zionist and anti-Israeli tone, and largely also anti-Western tone. On the contrary, some of the government media in Egypt, some of the Mubarak media, and of course Gaddafi hinted at the Zionist conspiracy and American, and just now an Israeli American is being jailed in Egypt for allegedly inciting the pro-democracy protests. So it doesn't quite correspond to how you describe the situation. So my first question would be: do you see any opportunities in what's been going on in the region, in that if the Middle East is more democratic, more open, then democracies do not go to war with each other, as we know, etc., etc., and should not Israel take a more active approach to this? And my second question would be, you used some quite flattering terms for some of the former rulers in those countries, and maybe they would apply to Mubarak, but would you really characterize Colonel Gaddafi as prudent, rational, and moderate, or Assad?
Then thank you, and then you, sir, in the front row here. Just wait for the microphone.
Hi, I'm Christopher Jackson. I'm a student from the University of York and an IISS member. I just wanted to ask if you felt within Israel that there's been any sort of demand from people, from local politicians now, who feel that now is exactly the time to sort of be making these moves towards peace. You still have a lot of sort of unease, and Iran is relatively tied up with trying to control the situation in Syria to some extent. Well, there is suggestions that they are helping the Syrian forces to maintain peace there. As you said, Hamas have been weakened partly because of Operation Cast Iron, and also in part due to new defense measures like the deployment of Iron Dome, which initially appears to be relatively successful. So has there been any sort of pressure for people to sort of almost preempt demands from the Palestinians for peace, and actually try and make Israel seem as the leader in this, and perhaps catch some of the other sort of Arab states offhand a little bit, take a lead and diffuse the situation?
Thank you. And then finally, the lady in the middle there, in the blue dress by the window.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, a lot of what I was going to say has been said by the gentleman sitting next door to me. I just wanted to challenge your narrative that the neighbours to Israel seem to have this kind of hateful attitude, that the Egyptian candidates seem to have this intrinsically hateful attitude. And I was just wanting to ask you to consider, perhaps it would be more productive to ask where this potentially anti-Israeli sentiment is coming from. And I would suggest that it's not from their intrinsically anti-Israeli hateful sentiment, but from the from Israel's day-to-day treatment of their Arab brothers, who are the Palestinians, which causes this, and it's only when this changes will Israel be respected by its neighbors.
Okay, well, the treatment of the Palestinians by the Israelis, of course, has much has given grounds for portraying Israel as a oppressive, perhaps occasionally brutal regime, without doubt. I would say I would put this in historical context. It was the Palestinians who rejected the 1947 partition agreement, attacked the Jewish community in Palestine in 1947-48 at the start of the 1948 war, and in some ways brought upon themselves what happened to them in the course of that war. And in various ways, in later stages of the history, also brought upon themselves various things that happened despite offers of some form of much stronger today as a result of what has happened in Egypt, and it's unspoken, but it's a certain firm alliance with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, and will probably benefit down the road even more by the strengthening of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. I don't know. I don't know what the chaos at the moment in the Arab world is offering in terms of opportunities for breakthroughs towards peace. The Fatah-Hamas agreement may be about a unity government, which seems to be dissolving quite rapidly these days. The Hamas is disagreeing about, is in disagreement about the candidate, who seems to be a reasonable person, Salam Fayyad, for the premiership of the future coalition government, but this alliance does not help, does not benefit the cause of peace if it exists, as I say, and even if it doesn't continue to exist, but its actual existence, this unity between these two parties, or this agreement, doesn't help the cause of peace, to the extent that one party in that agreement, the Hamas, says openly, I may have my suspicions about the Fatah, I believe I'm right about the Fatah leadership, but the Hamas one doesn't have to have suspicions about. They have a charter, they have a constitution published in 1988, which says simply, firmly, that they oppose Israel's existence and that jihad is the only way to eliminate it, and the Jews are basically devils. That's essentially what the Hamas charter says. They are one party of this unity agreement. How their empowerment in this unity government can help the cause of peace, I have no idea, because they will hamper, limit Abbas's ability to make any concessions, even if he was that way-minded, and I'm not sure he's that way-minded, concessions in the crucial fields of refugees, the borders, and so on. The Hamas won't allow it, so it's not going to help peace. You're right that Gaddafi wasn't a prudent politician, and he's one of the reckless ones, but so far the regime, he hasn't been toppled yet, you may have noticed, and neither has Assad, and neither of them appear to be leaving anytime soon. The ones who have been toppled in this upheaval in the Arab world so far are pro-Western regimes of reasonable, or I don't know what reasonable means. They also kill people in dark places and dungeons. But Mubarak, compared to some of his brothers, was a reasonable leader. And the guys in Tunisia also, a reasonable regime compared to some of these people who are still in power. So what is the net effect so far has been an undermining of the West's stature and power, and the rebels whom the West is assisting, say in Libya, are not particularly grateful to the West. They don't suddenly say, yes, we're going to join NATO now that you've been bombing Gaddafi to bits. We really appreciate you guys. They're not. Same as Pakistan hasn't been appreciative of Western American support. They send billions of dollars for flood victims, and then the Pakistanis go and help terrorists in various ways against pro-Western targets. So far the West has lost in this upheaval. So far. Maybe it'll turn out differently, but so far the West is on the losing side and doesn't seem to appear to gain anything from supporting the rebels.
Thank you very much indeed. I know that tonight in London you're giving a lecture on 1948.
Yeah, history.
But very glad that you allowed yourself to be lured off the historical ground and to address questions of the here and now with us here today. Please could you all join me in a round of applause for Professor Morris.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's great.
My pleasure. Thank you. Thank you.